Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Unless everybody wants to unmute and sing, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm totally fine with that, but I don't know what about y'all.
You don't want that, Father. It can get
ugly. So we're going to be picking up tonight at the beginning of chapter 11 of Exodus to kind of do a quick recap to where we were. Appropriately enough, on Sunday, we celebrated Pascha. So tonight we're going to be talking about Pascha, the first one, because Pascha, of course, is the Greek word for Passover. And so the last couple of Bible studies, we've been working our way through the plagues on Egypt. And tonight we're getting to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, aka the Passover. And so what we've seen leading up to this, we've talked about how the plagues are very much public displays of the power of Yahweh, the God of Israel, and of his power and his authority over the creation in particular. We talked about how that is very deliberately, in terms of the shape of the plagues themselves, very deliberately over against the supposed authority of the gods of Egypt, including Pharaoh himself. That these plagues have shown that those gods that they have been worshiping, those spiritual powers, which they've been offering sacrifices to which they've essentially, the Egyptians have become enslaved, do not have the power and authority that they have claimed and been claimed to have had. And this public display and the way it is oriented toward the Egyptian gods is particularly important, as we've seen, because this orientation shows us that the plagues are not only intended for the Israelites. Okay? Because, I mean, skip the plagues, right? God could have just smashed the Egyptian army, led the Israelites out. That would have been a sufficient display of his power, right, for the Israelites, right, to know that he is indeed their God and that they should indeed be worshiping and following only him. But so there was not an issue, or not a major issue, as far as we could tell in the text, with Israelites having started to worship all of these different Egyptian gods in such a way that God would need to do these separate plagues, sort of displaying the powerlessness of these individual Egyptian gods for the sake of getting Israelites to return to their own God. All that means that God is putting on this display of power for the Egyptians and for the other non-Israelite peoples in Egypt, the other migrants, people from Libya, other African countries, like the Nubians and the Cushites, right, who would have been in the vicinity of Egypt. And we know from later on in the scriptures, not only those who were there to sort of witness firsthand, but those who would later hear the report. Right, we've mentioned before that by the time Joshua and Caleb are sent as spies to go into Jericho, to go into the land of Canaan, the people there, as we see with Rahab, have heard about what happened in Egypt. Right, they've heard this report beforehand. They know about it. So God is interested not only in revealing himself to those people who are his people, who are going to be part of his nation of Israel, but to the whole world. but to the whole world. And this is important in our understanding not only of Israel in the Old Testament, but also to our understanding of the church in the New Testament and subsequent history and today. Right? Often the Israelites, the Old Testament, it's, oh, these are the chosen people. And they're thought of ethnically, right? God chose this ethnic people. It's a question of biology. And God chose them, meaning they're sort of his favorites, right? They're the ones who are saved, and the other 70 nations, those Gentiles, they can all, right, go to hell in a handbasket. He doesn't care, right? Because he has his people, right? And he's not concerned with them. That's sometimes the way we talk about the Old Testament. And some of our Protestant friends then take that same approach to the church in the New Testament and in subsequent history and today, right? People who are in the church, people who are Christians, those are the people God chose. Those are the people God loves. And the people who aren't in the church, however it's conceived, the people who aren't Christians, however that's defined, and both of those definitions have gotten very loose, like in modern American life. But those people are bad and evil, and God's going to send them to hell, right? That there's bad people outside, and God isn't all that concerned with them, other than that he sent us to go try to convert them to Christianity. Because then if they do whatever is involved in that, then God will love them. But if we look at what's actually going on here with Israel, as Israel is being formed, and we're really going to read about the first major event in the formation of Israel, right? Because Israel doesn't exist. Israel is not one of the 70 nations on the table of nations in Genesis 10. God doesn't, when he decides to have a nation for himself, go and pick one. He doesn't choose one of the 70 nations to be his nation. He creates Israel. He makes a people that, as he will say over and over again, previously was not a people, was not a nation, did not have a land of its own. He creates them and he gives them a land of their own. So that conditions what is meant by the word choose, right? What does it mean that he chose them? Well, it means he created them, right? And not just he created them in the sense that, well, yeah, I mean, he created all the nations, didn't he? He created all the people that make them up, at least. Yes, but he created Israel for a special purpose. For a special purpose. And that special purpose is not salvation as opposed to everybody else. Because you don't have to read very far in the Old Testament to realize there's a whole lot of people who are ethnically Israelites later on in the Old Testament who aren't experiencing what we would call salvation. They're engaged in idolatry. They're engaged in all kinds of sin and unrepentant wickedness. And the whole history of the nation is going to go to bad places because of that, right? So that's not the purpose, right? The purpose that we see being served, beginning with the plagues, right, is that God is, through Israel, saying something to all the nations. Israel is the vehicle through which God is going to bring salvation into the world. And we know ultimately that comes to its climax when Jesus is born, the Messiah is born, Christ is born, right, out of the nation of Israel. That's where, right, that's going to come to a head. But the beginnings of that are already here, right? The deliverance of Israel. Israel is being created out of Egypt, out of sort of the fire of Egyptian slavery, in order to express something, not even primarily to Israel, but to the world, about who the true God is, who they ought to come to worship. And then we'll talk about this more as we go on, because there are going to be other ways that this is talked about. But it's very important that we remember this element, that to be chosen means to be chosen for a particular purpose. That's true for Israel. That's true for the church in the New Testament and subsequent history. Right? If we are in the church, right, and we say, yes, the church is chosen by God, we're God's people, that means we are called to a purpose by him in the world. Right? In the world. That we are serving the rest of the world because God's interest is in saving the whole creation, not just saving his chosen group out of it, right? But in saving the whole creation through his people, right? Through his people. And so we're seeing that already in one way right here off the bat. So the other thing we've seen throughout the plagues is again and again, and you can go and listen to the last two Bible studies. I think in both of them, we talk about the language of the hardening of the heart. But throughout these plagues, each plague was potentially an opportunity for Egyptian repentance, for Pharaoh to do what he should do, to be obedient to the God of Israel. And each of those was forsaken. And we've seen Pharaoh make excuses. We've seen him try to compromise. We've seen him straight out lie and say he would let the people go and then renege after the plague ended. And after the 9th plague, we saw him go so far as to throw Moses and Aaron out and say, the next time I see you, you're dead. So repentance is not happening. And so we're going to go to this 10th plague. We're going to go to this most terrible of the plagues. And this is now going to be sort of the full measure now of God's judgment, of God correcting the injustice that has prevailed in the way the Egyptians have treated the Israelites and the wickedness of the Egyptians. The scales are now going to be fully balanced. And at the same time, we're going to see the beginning of, right? So Exodus is part of the Torah. The Torah, though it gets translated as law, is primarily about a way of life that God is laying out for the Israelite people. And we're also going to see the beginnings of that way of life sketched out here in the context of this sort of first great event in Israelite history. So all that said by way of recap, unless there are any late-breaking questions or comments or anybody else who wants to say Christ has risen in a weird language and try to stump everybody on the response, we'll go ahead and pick up at the beginning of Exodus chapter 11 and verse 1. Now the Lord said to Moses, I will bring yet one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here. Okay, so he says there's one last plague coming, the 10th. There's one last plague coming. And God has said all along, remember when he first sent Moses to talk to Pharaoh, he told him in advance, he's not going to listen to you. Right? And he's told to repeat, he's still not going to listen to you. Right? So God knows what's going on. It's not that God really wants Pharaoh to let the people go, and Pharaoh is like somehow more powerful than God and is stopping God from doing that. Right? Again, God is doing this for the purpose of revealing himself, revealing his justice to the whole world, right? So God knows this is how it's going to play out. And here he says, when this last one comes, he's going to let you go. And not only is he going to let you go, he's going to make you go, right? They're going to be desperate for you to go. They're going to force you to go. They're going to drive you out of here. Verse 2, speak now secretly in the hearing of the people, and let everyone ask from his neighbor articles of silver and gold and clothing. So the Lord gave the people grace in the sight of the Egyptians, and they lent to them. Moreover, the man Moses was very great before the Egyptians and before Pharaoh and all his servants. Okay. So we see the beginning of something here. So while, as we've seen, Pharaoh is not willing to humble himself enough to let the Israelites go in his arrogance, that, you know, the Egyptian people are not completely stupid. They've seen these other 9 plagues. They know something is going on here. They've seen how a bunch of these plagues, including the last one, the darkness, which was sort of a direct attack on Re, the sun god, who is the king of the gods in Egyptian terms at this time, that, you know, it's dark at noontime over the whole land of Egypt, except where the Israelites live, right? People see this. They're not completely dumb. They realize something is going on. And so God gives Moses this tip off and says, have the Israelites go to their Egyptian neighbors. Now notice, they're living mixed together, right? So up to this point, when we see a plague affecting the Egyptians but not affecting the Israelites, that's in terms of Goshen, the area, the particular land in the Nile Delta where the Israelites primarily live. That area is not affected. So the Egyptians living among the Israelites sort of luck out, right? Like they don't suffer some of these plagues because they're living in these Israelite areas, right? So it's not completely segregated, right? Egyptians and Israelites in different neighborhoods. So they say, go to your Egyptian neighbors and ask them for things, right? And the Egyptian people at this point, even some of the wealthy, even some of those in Pharaoh's court, have seen, you know, what has happened, and they go ahead and they do that, right? And so now Moses is going to again go to confront Pharaoh for the last time. Then Moses said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against not even one of the descendants of Israel, be it man or cattle, shall a dog snarl its tongue, that you may know the Lord shall make a wide distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, go from here, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out. Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. So Pharaoh obviously is not happy, right, with this prediction. And I was asked the question, you know, are they trying to sort of bribe Israel's God? Sort of. They want to be in their understanding, right? Clearly, these people are being favored by God or the gods, however they conceive that, right? Clearly, these people are being favored somehow in these calamities that are coming upon Israel. So it just makes good horse sense for them to want to be in good, right? With these people who seem to be in good with the gods, right? That, you know, whoever these people are, they clearly have some kind of influence, and it behooves me to want them to think kindly of me rather than badly of me. But so what is God saying he's going to do? There's some important details here that I think get glossed over when we get to later parts of the story. So it's worth taking a minute, right? So God says he is going to come, and the firstborn, these are the firstborn males. It's in the masculine in the original language. So these are the firstborn males of everyone, from the firstborn male of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn male of, and this is a slave girl, like in the worst job, right? This is so from the top to bottom, everybody among the Egyptians, right? And even the cattle. And we may have mentioned before, that's a way of throwing in animals as a way of speaking in extremis in Hebrew. So, for example, at the end of the book of Jonah, which we just read pretty much the whole book on Holy Saturday, it says at the end, when God is kind of chastising Jonah for being so upset about the vine dying, the vine that had given him shade for like a few hours and had grown up suddenly and it dies, and he's all upset about it dying. But he's not upset about Nineveh. He was kind of hoping that the people of Nineveh would get what he thought was coming to them. And he says, do you not know that there are all of these thousands of people in Nineveh who do not know their right hand from their left, and many cattle, right? That and many cattle, right, is sort of saying to Jonah, like, hey, even if you don't like the Assyrian people, at least think of the cows, right? Think of the cows, Jonah, right? The idea being this is like in extremis. So when God says everyone from the top to the bottom, even the cattle, right? This is saying the fullest extent, right? The fullest extent. So this is obviously the most horrible of the plagues, right? So a lot of people have suffered and suffered greatly. But when there were plagues that could have potentially killed a lot of people, for example, the hail that fell, there was this warning, hey, you need to stay indoors. You need to not go out in the field because you'll be killed, right? But this plague is involving mass death, right? So why this? And if we're talking about which God this is directed at, well, you can see from where Moses starts, this is directed squarely at Pharaoh himself, who at this point in Egyptian history, they believed was sort of an incarnation isn't the right word, because when I say incarnation, you're going to think of the incarnation of Christ, and that's not how they thought it worked. He is basically a body. Pharaoh is basically a living idol of the god Horus at this point in history. And so was worshipped as a god himself. Pharaoh not only offered sacrifices in a priestly way, but received sacrifices as a king at this time in history. So his firstborn son's life being taken is sort of eminent proof as the most precious thing to him, his heir, right? If the God of Israel is able to take away the most precious thing to him, then Pharaoh isn't a god, at least not one worth worshiping or thinking much about, right? But also, why this particular thing? Because it seems very ghastly, right? Well, we have to go back to where we started in Exodus. What did Pharaoh do? Pharaoh ordered the death of all of the male children of Israel. He ordered that the male children of all of the Israelites be murdered. First, he ordered that they be aborted. And then when the midwives refused to do it, he would just put out a general order to all Egyptians that if you see a male Israelite infant, you drown it in the Nile. Not just the firstborn, all of them. And by having the Egyptian people carry out this order, he made them all complicit in it. The Egyptian people had killed the sons of the Israelites. And so when we talk about justice being restoring of order, we talk about the balancing of the scales. In this case, the horrific crimes committed by the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians lose what they took from the Israelites. The Egyptians lose what they took from the Israelites. Although even here, there's a little bit of mercy because it's only the firstborn, as opposed to the Egyptians massacring all of the Israelite baby boys. So this is a balancing of the scales. But notice, even within this, it does not say they're going to die some horrible, tortuous, painful death. And it's going to happen at midnight. It's going to happen in the middle of the night. Right? So this is they're going to die in their sleep. Right? Which is a much less painful kind of death than, drowning infants or strangling infants, which is how the abortion basically would have been done, that Pharaoh ordered. So this is what's going to now happen, right? This is what's now going to happen. Pharaoh is going to be powerless to stop it. The Egyptian gods that have the powers of life and death are going to be unable to stop it or do anything about it, no matter how many sacrifices they offer to them. The other piece to notice here in this announcement is that we have another sort of in extremis thing. On the one hand, we had even the cattle, and now we have a dog's not even going to snarl at the Israelites, right? Like, not only are their children not going to die, right? Not only are their children not going to die, like, not only is nothing else bad going to happen to them, like, a dog's not going to growl at them. There's not even going to be like a threat or a hint of danger for them, right? As there is for the Egyptians. Right? Now notice here, because we're going to get to this in a second, we may have leapt ahead. When we think of the first Passover, the first Pascha, we think of putting blood on the doorposts, right? They had to put the blood on the doorposts to get the angel to pass over. That's not what it says here. God says he's not coming anywhere near an Israelite. And he says he's doing that because he wants everyone to see the distinction he makes, the division, the separation he makes between Egyptians and Israelites, the distinction between the two. So it is never in the picture in this text that God would want to kill any Israelite baby. There's no need for any kind of substitution. Why would God want any of the Israelite children to die? A whole generation of Israelite children has already been murdered by Pharaoh. Why would God want to cause any more of them to die? That would be further injustice. Right? So God never has any intention of any harm. A dog's not going to growl at them coming to any Israelite, regardless. Right? Regardless. A little further ahead, we'll talk about what's going on with that blood on the doorpost. Verse 9, but the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, that I may multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Right? So God, again, knows what's going to happen. He says, after this plague, yes, they're going to drive you out. But even though you just went and warned him, he's not going to listen to you. And sort of the full measure of God's justice now is going to fall on Egypt. Verse 10, so Moses and Aaron did all these signs and wonders in the land of Egypt before Pharaoh. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel depart from the land of Egypt. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Okay. So this is the beginning of something very interesting, right? Because God has made this announcement. Here's what's happening tonight at midnight. The firstborn of Egypt are going to die. This 10th plague is going to happen. The full measure of God's justice is going to fall upon Egypt. And now he starts talking to them about the calendar. Now he starts talking to them about the way of life they're going to follow going forward once they're out of Egypt, and even once they get into the land, which is more than a generation from now, as God knows already. Right? He starts talking to them about that. And what we're going to see here as we go forward is that God is going to, right now, before the Passover happens, God is going to talk to them and describe to them when and how they are to celebrate it in the future. How they're going to commemorate it, celebrate it in the future, but he's telling them, he's laying it out for them, he's instructing them before it happens. Why am I putting so much emphasis on this? Well, if we were able to attend church last week, and we were paying attention, may have noticed that Christ laid out and described the Eucharist and how it was to be celebrated and what was to be done in it before he died and rose again. Right? He said, "This is my body broken for you," before his body was broken. He said, "This is my blood shed for you," before his blood was shed. And this is built in when St. Paul, 1 Corinthians was actually written before the Synoptic Gospels. When St. Paul describes the Eucharist, he says, on the night that he was betrayed, he even points out, this is before it happened. Why is it laid out that way? Well, because that's how the first Passover was laid out. Right? Christ predicted his death. At the mystical supper, he gave his disciples the instructions regarding the Eucharist. Then he died and rose again. Then Pascha, then the Passover happened. And that's following this same pattern from Exodus, from the Torah, from the Pentateuch, where Moses goes and prophesies, predicts, this is what's going to happen, the death of the firstborn. They are instructed in how the Passover will be celebrated. Then the Passover happens. Right? So it's the same pattern. Right? Now, here in this first verse, Moses and Aaron are told, this will be for you the first of months. Right? So month number 1, right, is going to be Nissan. That's the name it's going to have. Not the car company in Japan. It's spelled slightly differently. But this is going to be the first month of the year for you. Now, if you know anything about Jewish holidays, that might trigger a memory in you that, like, wait a minute, I thought they celebrated the new year on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah literally means the head of the year or the beginning of the year, right, in Hebrew. And that's Tishri 1. That's roughly in September on the Jewish calendar. That's going to be laid out later in the Torah, later in the Pentateuch. That's the first day of the year. So how can they have 2 first days of the year? Right? Well, there are actually, in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, there are 2 different calendars, one laid over the other. So there's one calendar that is the older calendar. This calendar actually already existed at this time. And that calendar is usually referred to as the agricultural calendar. It begins in the fall. Right? And it is based on the harvest and then the planting in the spring. Right? That's the pattern. That's what that calendar is formed around. Right? And pretty much everybody in the ancient world had an agricultural calendar like this as at least one layer of their calendar. This was true in the Roman Empire and then in the Byzantine Empire. This is why we still have, on September 1st, the indiction, we have the ecclesiastical New Year. This is also why school and stuff starts in September, right? That's going back to that old agricultural based calendar, where the year begins in September. And we still have that in the church. But what is added here, beginning right here in this verse we just read, in the verses we're about to read, the Passover is added as another layer on top of that. And so this calendar, it consists of a series, what are going to become a series of feasts, we'll see as we go on, whose dating is dependent on the date of the Passover celebration. And as the date of the Passover celebration sort of floats, all of those will float with it in relation to the agricultural calendar, which is relatively stable. Okay. Does that sound familiar to anybody here in the Orthodox Church? Right. We still have that exact same pattern that's laid out here in the Torah, where we have certain feasts that are on that sort of agricultural calendar. September 1st, right? March 25th, December 25th, January 6th, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That are on fixed dates, September 14th, right? And then we have another set of feasts, right? And fasts like Lent, right? But Pascha, Ascension, Pentecost, right? That float with Pascha as it moves over the top of that calendar, right? So this is the beginning of the laying out of that second layer of the calendar that we still use to this day in the Orthodox Church, the same way it's laid out here. I'm not going to go into it all now. Somebody may ask it in the question and answer thing, but believe it or not, Jewish people, Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Christians, and Roman Catholics all calculate the date of Pascha / Passover / Easter the exact same way. We all actually have the exact same calculation. What we have different underlying calendars that calculation is made over against. So Orthodox Jewish folks still have a lunar calendar over which they're making that calculation. We have the Julian calendar, and Roman Catholics have the Gregorian calendar over which they're making those calculations. There's a little more to it than that. If anybody really cares and wants to go into it at this point in Bright Week, we can later in the question and answer, or not. If nobody cares, that's fine. We can talk about other things. But suffice it to say, it's the same calculation. We're all doing the first full moon after the vernal equinox. There's just then a bunch of things that happen in terms of when the equinox is and how we figure out when the full moon is that complicate that. And of course, we celebrate our Pascha on Sunday always, whereas the Jewish Passover can be any day of the week. Right? So, but this whole second set now is beginning to be established right here as the way in which Passover is going to be celebrated after it actually happens is laid out here. So verse 3, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the family household, a lamb for each home. If there be too few in a household, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of souls. He will make his count in lambs according to the needs of each one. Okay. So this is already very important and glossed over very quickly. So we already mentioned in the prophecy about how there's not an element of substitution here, that God never intends to harm a single Israelite, period. Right? That's part of what he said to Pharaoh. Right. But nonetheless, there are some folks who want to interpret what's going to happen in the Passover as God really wants to kill the children of the Israelites also for reasons not explained, but he'll take a lamb instead. right? So the lamb is being substituted for the Israelite family's firstborn son. And we've already seen one big monkey wrench in that, one spanner in the works, and that was the idea that God never intended to harm any Israelite children. But there's another one here, and that's in the apportionment, right? Because what does it say? It says a lamb per household. So that's the first command, one lamb per household. Why is that a problem from the substitution perspective? What if you only have girls? Does that mean you don't have to do the whole Passover thing? It's just optional? Right? Like, just, oh, yeah, I don't have any male children, so I guess I could skip, right? God's commandment about the Passover, right? What if I'm a firstborn son, I have a firstborn son, and my dad was a firstborn son, and we're all in the household? Do I need 3 lambs? No, I just need one for all 3 of us, apparently. And then the second verse here makes it even worse for the people who want to make that case, because the second verse here says, hey, if your family is too small to eat a whole lamb by yourself, then you could go with another small household and the 2 of you could just share one lamb, right? Regardless of how many firstborn sons there may not be between those 2 families, right? So if this was an issue where the lamb was being substituted for the firstborn son, we would expect to see 1 lamb per firstborn son. And that's not quite the opposite, but definitely not what we see here. It's not how it works, right? So I was asked, it's very reason to believe the general population heard these pronouncements of Moses. Or you just tell Pharaoh? Well, he just announces it to Pharaoh, but we're going to talk about the rest of that question here in just a minute. Okay. So verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it from the sheep or the kids. Okay. So without blemish, right? We give our best to God, right? So you don't go and find the scruffiest looking one. You don't go and find the one with a broken leg. You don't go and find the one that looks sickly and like it might die anyway, right? You give God the best one, the choice one, no blemishes, right? The most perfect one you have. Then you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So everyone is going to, at the same time, right? They all kill the lamb at the same time. Notice something. This is another nail in the coffin of the idea that there's substitution going on here. It doesn't say how to kill it. How do they kill it? Do they strangle it? Do they slit its throat? Do they decapitate it? There's lots of ways. I don't want to be overly graphic, but there's lots of ways you could kill the lamb, right? Doesn't say how. What does that mean? We're going to find this with sacrifices later in the Torah too. It never says how to kill them, because the killing of the animal isn't ritualized. That's really what that means, right? To ritualize something means you give specific instructions. It has to always be done this way, right? And when you get those instructions, it must be already done, always done this way. Then you say, okay, well, these instructions then are important. These instructions symbolize something, right? If you have to kill it, for example, in a certain way, that would mean that the killing of it represents something, right? There is some kind of symbolism going on here with how it is killed. When there's no instructions, that means the exact opposite. That means that the killing part is irrelevant. right? It means you have to kill it in order to do what we're about to do, right? Which is going to include eating it. I mean, it seems stupid to say, to us, it seems stupid to say, well, yeah, you have to kill something before you can cook it and eat it. Keep in mind, there are lots of animals, crustaceans, for example, that get cooked live for people to eat, right? But in the ancient world, if we're talking about ancient sacrifices, there were a lot of things that were sacrificed alive. And in some extreme cases, like in the Dionysian mysteries in Greek and Roman history, animals were eaten alive. So that does not go without saying when it comes to ancient Near Eastern religious ritual, that you kill it before you cook it and eat it, right? So it does have to mention you kill it first. But the fact that it's not, that specific instructions are not given for that killing means it's not ritualized killing. It's killing just because we need to do this in order to get to the important ritual parts. So the important ritual parts, the symbolism, what this means is coming now. Verse 7, then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Okay. So first reason you have to kill it is you got to extract the blood. Right? You got to extract the blood from it, probably in a bowl. You take that blood and you put the blood on the lintel and the doorposts, right? You've probably seen old Sunday school drawings of somebody with like the big horsetail brush or something, right? Putting the blood, right, on the doorpost to mark it. Okay. Then verse 8, they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, nor shall you break a bone of it. And what remains of it until morning, you shall burn with fire. Okay. So it has to be cooked in a particular way, meaning the cooking has particular importance, right? This mode of cooking. So you notice it has to be cooked whole with its entrails still inside it, right? So they're not taking the lamb and cleaning the meat and doing all of this. It is roasted over a fire whole, not boiled, not eaten raw. And it's only what they can eat that night. Everything else gets burned up, gets sacrificed the next morning, right? It's given to God, anything that's left. But they eat it that night. Okay? And why roasted over fire? And why not cleaned? Well, for 2 reasons. Number one, as we're about to see, they're about to be in a hurry, right? To get out of Egypt, right? It takes a long time, you know, to clean out the entrails of the animal, to go to butcher it, to do all of this, right? And then to prepare it to eat and do all. So this is sort of the quick way, right? You kill it, you drain the blood, you skin it, you roast it, you eat, right? Do it quickly. But also, remember, Egypt has already been described as a furnace. The oppression in Egypt has already been described as a furnace, as heat, as fire, right? And you notice you eat it with bitter herbs. So remember also, these instructions are not just, here's what you do tonight. These instructions come after, this will be for you the first of months. Right? This will be for you the first. This is how you're going to celebrate it in the future. So the person in the future, the person 100 years after this, who is roasting the lamb and eating the bitter herbs, right? This roasting, this eating of the bitter herbs is going to be about making them a participant in the experience of the bitterness and the furnace of Egypt, the suffering of slavery, and thereby the deliverance from it, right? The freedom from it. So this is aimed at, right? This ritual is aimed at, this event is about to happen. In the future, you will celebrate it in this way so that those future people can participate in this event that's about to happen. Keep in mind still the parallels with Christ's institution of the Eucharist and how the future ritual participation becomes a participation in the historical event. Thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Pascha, Passover. So again, the person in the future isn't necessarily about to go on a long foot trip the way they are, right? But the person in the future still dresses as if they're about to go on a journey. Because again, they're participating in this deliverance of the Israelite people. Verse 12, for I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute vengeance. I am the Lord. This is a very important verse, right? So when he says why, he says, why is this the Lord's Passover? Because he is going to pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all of the gods of Egypt, he will execute judgment. Right? That's what's happening here. He's executing judgment against the gods of Egypt. First thing that means is they're not fictional characters. Right? Because that would be kind of silly for God to come and announce, I am now going to execute judgment against the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Right? I'm going to display my power by beating up Batman, who is a fictional character. Right? But again, we've already talked about what is his concern here. God loves the Egyptians, the people, the humans. The human people, the Egyptians. He loves them. Right? He doesn't just want to free the Israelites, he wants to free them. Who's holding them in bondage? What is it and who is it that's leading Pharaoh into his incredible pride and arrogance and downright narcissism, thinking himself to be a god? Who is it who is really behind the murder of the Israelite children? Right? This isn't just a question. When we see evil on this scale, and this isn't the last time by far in human history where there was massive evil on this large scale. It's not just a question of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of humans all making the same bad decisions at the same time. National Socialism in Europe was not a whole bunch of German people just making the same bad decisions at the same time by happenstance. Stalinism, the Bolshevik Revolution, were not just a case of a whole bunch of Russians making the same bad decision at the same time. There are spirits and forces behind these things that motivate these things, that enslave people through the passions and through sin, that enslave them to death. Right? And that when you start out with the passions, we talk about passions, sins as passions in the Orthodox Church, because they make you passive. Once you let anger take control of you, you aren't making decisions about your actions anymore. Once you give into anger, you do things that horrify you once you come to your senses afterwards. You do things that if you weren't angry, you would never think of doing. Once you let pride get a hold of you, once you let envy get a hold of you, once you let lust get a hold of you, right? You give rein to it, you will end up doing things that horrify you yourself, right? Because they make you passive. And this is what is going on in Egypt. Because Egypt has forgotten the true God who created them and created the universe, has begun worshiping these demonic powers, has yielded themselves to sin and passions, right? They're now being, there was something possessing Pharaoh, all right. It just wasn't properly a god, right? And they're driving them, but it's a bondage for them too, that's leading them to destruction. Not just destruction in this world, but eternal destruction and eternal condemnation. And so God wants to free the Egyptians too. And so this isn't really about punishing the Egyptians. This isn't about making the Egyptians suffer for their sins. This is about God displaying, as he says there, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, right? Displaying who he is to the Egyptians once again. Displaying the powerlessness and the wickedness of the Egyptians' gods to them, so that they can turn to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and be set free from that spirit that's been driving them, right? That's enslaved them, right, through sin. And so when we talk about on our Pascha, Christ setting us free from sin to serve the living God, right? That's not just an analogy to what happened at the first Pascha, the first Passover. It's the fulfillment of it. It's the fullness of it, not just an allegory or analogy, right? So God comes to judge the gods of the Egyptians and to do it publicly before the Egyptians and before the rest of the world. And here then is when he says, verse 13, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial. And anamnesis in the Greek, the same word Christ uses. Do this as my remembrance. Do this as my memorial. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. So what is God doing, right? He's already said to Pharaoh, I'm not touching an Israelite, right? So marking the doorposts with blood is about who is an Israelite and who is not. Who's an Israelite, who's an Egyptian? And that's not decided based on your DNA that they didn't know existed yet. It's not decided based on doing genealogical research as to ethnicity. Right? Israel as a nation is being created. So who is an Israelite is going to be decided by who follows these instructions. You could be a full-blooded descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and not follow these commands, and guess what? You're now an Egyptian. You're not an Israelite. Or you could be a full-blooded Egyptian, right? A full-blooded Egyptian. Keep these commandments, and after this night, you're an Israelite from having marked your doorpost. So the distinction that God makes is made ritually, is made through this ritual and obedience to this ritual. Right? And later in the Torah, right, this is being laid out for the future, as we just saw. This is going to be an ordinance for you forever, right? Later on, we're going to see in the Torah that there are two markers. There are two things that make you an Israelite. Neither of them has anything to do with DNA, heredity, ethnicity, the color of your skin, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes. Nothing to do with any of that. Two things. If you're male, are you circumcised? And if you're male, female, child, whatever, right? Do you eat the Passover? That's it. Those are the two things. If you do that, you're an Israelite. If not, you're not. And it doesn't matter otherwise. This also is taken over into the church, right? If you look at the canons of the church, the canon that says, you know, what's the lowest common denominator that makes you an Orthodox Christian, right? Where do you cross the line where you're no longer an Orthodox Christian? Well, there's two things. Number one, you have to be baptized. Number two, you have to receive the Eucharist at least once a year at Pascha. If you don't do that, you're officially lapsed. There's actually a service to bring you back into the church if you are lapsed as an Orthodox Christian, because you didn't keep those. If you do those, at least those two things, you're still an Orthodox Christian. Your standing may vary, right? Etc. With confession and everything else. But that's sort of the bare minimum marker. It's taken over directly from this. And that comes from this moment. And so this is the reason for this ongoing ritual in the future, right? Because there's going to be generations and generations of people in the future who weren't there for this event. They weren't there historically when Israel was formed, when Israel was delivered from Egypt. And they're going to come to participate in it through this ritual, right? They're going to participate in it. It's going to be part of their experience. Right? At the Passover, they didn't say, this is the night when our distant ancestors were delivered from slavery in Egypt. They say, this is the night we were delivered from slavery in Egypt. Right? And we followed the same pattern last week. Right? We said, today he is suspended on a tree. This is the day of resurrection. Right? Because we living, getting awful close to 2,000 years later, right, come to participate in that event, to be a part of that event ritually, right, through our celebration, which culminates in the eating of the Eucharist, the eating of the Passover. So the answer to the most recently asked question in chat is yes. The long answer is yes. So verse 15, we're back to the instructions. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. Where do we get the concept of Holy Week? Technically, Lent ends right before Lazarus Saturday. Right? Holy Week is its own thing. Right? Where do we get Holy Week? A week leading up to Pascha? Right here. There's a week leading up to Passover. And there is a kind of, we already see here, a kind of fasting that takes place. Verse 16, on the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No servile work shall be done on them, and whatever must be done by each soul, this only shall be done by you. Right? So that week, you don't do anything that isn't necessary. If you're most people at this time in history and you're working a farm, there's a fair amount that's necessary, right? But you don't do any unnecessary additional work. You don't go making business deals during this week leading up to Pascha. You don't do these things. You focus on prayer. You focus on these events. Verse 17, so you shall keep this commandment. For on this same day I will bring your army out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month, at evening. For 7 days, no leaven shall be found in your houses. Since whoever eats what is leavened, that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. So these are the instructions given to Moses and Aaron. And again, the instructions given for the future, right? Which includes that night when the event is going to actually happen. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go away and take a lamb for yourselves according to your families and sacrifice the Pascha. Then you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood in the basin. But none of you shall go out from the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass by the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses and strike you." Notice the phrasing, right? That phrasing is not unimportant. He's coming to strike the Egyptians. When he sees the blood, he will not strike your house because he will know that you're not Egyptians, you're Israelites. Now you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your children forever. So if you enter the land the Lord shall give you, as he promised, you shall keep this service. Thus it shall be, when your children say to you, "What does this service mean?" that you shall say, "This is the paschal sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households." So the people bowed down and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. And I think actually I am going to stop here for tonight. And we can answer some questions. And we'll pick up next time with sort of the Exodus proper and get into the Red Sea and all that. Because there's going to be a lot there, including learning more than you ever thought you wanted to know about the Egyptian god Mantu. There's a teaser. Who is considered to be the destroyer? We will meet him next time. Yes, we will meet him next time. We will talk more about that. And we'll talk about how that's related to a figure by a very similar name who shows up in the book of Revelation. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about the destroyer next time, because he's going to make an appearance right at the beginning next time. So anybody has any questions they want to ask can unmute and ask, or type in the chat. But the more bold and manly thing to do at a men's Bible study, I think, is to unmute and turn your camera on and ask it in person. I can't back that up really, but I'm just saying that because I prefer not having to keep putting my reading glasses on and read the chat. Ulterior motives.
Father, the only reason I typed the question about the destroyers, I had a mouthful of pizza.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm just very vain about my reading glasses, so it's my fault.
The reason I'm typing them all in is because I'm in the middle of a soccer game. So
That's
I
fair.
think typing is easier.
That's fair.
But I did have another dumb question. If nobody has a good question. Somebody else is typing out and go.
Okay. I think he passed to you, Eric, if you have a question.
I'm trying to find my question, so I'm still scrambling looking for it. So
go for it, Mark.
Okay, I'll ask my dumb question then. So if you are an ethnic Egyptian who has joined the Israelites, how do you end up in a particular tribe?
Yeah, so what we're going to see, we'll see some specific examples of this. One of the big ones is Caleb. So Caleb, when we're introduced to him, is a Kenizzite, which is one of the Canaanite clans. And then at the end of his story, at the end of the book of Joshua, he's an elder of the tribe of Judah. And it's sort of like, wait, what? Right? Like, Judah's his forefather now. And that's really how it works, because each tribe is made up of clans, which are big groups of extended families. And each clan is made up of big extended families. And so becoming an Israelite didn't just mean, it wasn't like, joining a lot of modern churches, right? Where it's just, okay, now your name's on the member roll, right? But when you became an Israelite, you actually joined a family. You joined one of these big extended families. And that extended family was part of a clan, and that clan was part of a tribe, right? And that made you part of that tribe. And this is something that I think we really need to get back to. We have all the tools to do it in the Orthodox Church. This is built into how converts are received in the Orthodox Church. We've just tend to not stress it much. This is part of the thing with sponsors and godparents. So in the Orthodox Church, when someone sponsors you, it serves as your sponsor when you enter the church. You are now part of their family. Right? So if an older couple sponsors you into the Orthodox Church, you can't marry their daughter because she's your sister, as far as the church is concerned. Right? You have joined that family, right? You are now a part of that family, and that family is part of a parish, right? And that parish is part of a diocese, and that diocese is part of an archdiocese, right? But this is why I say to people, no one joins the Orthodox Church, really. You join an Orthodox Church. You become part of a worshiping community that is Orthodox Christian. And by virtue of being a member of that community, you're part of the Orthodox Church. Right? So it works very much the same way traditionally. We've just lost a lot of that sense, right? We ask somebody to sponsor us and then we forget about them later, or, we say hi and, they say happy name day or whatever, right? And that's about it, right? But it's much more serious than that traditionally in the church. And that's the way it worked. That's the way it worked back then, right? Is that, you became part of an actual extended family. And that was part of a clan that's part of a tribe. Right? But there's this suspicious number of people we're going to see even going forward in later generations with Egyptian names. Like, it's obvious why Moses has an Egyptian name, right? He's adopted by Pharaoh. Right? But why does his sister have an Egyptian name? Miriamni is an Egyptian name that has the name of a pagan Egyptian god in it. Miriamni, it means beloved of Amun in Egyptian. Aaron has an Egyptian name. Phinehas, who's Aaron's grandson, has an Egyptian name. We know part of why that is because his mother was Libyan. Eleazar, Aaron's son, married a woman from southern Libya. Their son has an Egyptian name. So there are these folks, right? And we're going to see when we get to the first, right now we're at the first Pascha. When we get to the first Pentecost, we're going to see that at the foot of Mount Sinai, all of the Israelites converted. Their children were the first cradle Israelites. That's not them. right? They all converted at the foot of Mount Sinai. But we'll get to that when we get to the first Pentecost as a teaser.
Think about it. I've got other follow-up dumb questions that I think that's Eric's turn.
Father, what you were describing with joining the clan or joining the family is very Klingon. It's like joining the House of Martok.
Yes. Have you been watching Picard season 3?
Oh man, yes. I have to say, I'm feeling all the chills from the Enterprise D being reconstructed.
Here's the problem. My dog got a huge promotion and it went straight to her head.
Oh, that's right. Shelby was an admiral, but she also met her demise.
Yes, she's a fleet admiral. My dog, she's intolerable now.
Oh, actually, I thought of your dog when I saw Admiral Shelby. That's so funny. All right, we'll get off of Star Trek. Does anybody else have any questions that are
Sean has his hand up. Sean has his hand up. So he had his hand up first.
Father bless.
Bless you.
Thank you. How you doing,
risen.
Brother? He's risen indeed. Thank you very much. Really quick question, just to understand. The famous Charlton Heston movie 10 Commandments.
Yes.
There's a really interesting sub story in there where before the destroyer came, I guess there was a Hebrew boy that was in love with an Egyptian girl, and so he snuck out in the middle of the night and put some blood over the doorpost of his girlfriend's house or whatever. And after everything went down, the father and the girl got kicked out with the rest of the Israelites, and he was rather upset because he was like, I didn't put that there. I don't understand. So, I mean, it was kind of cute, but according to what you're saying, that would not have been authentic because it was more than just the blood on the doorpost. They would have had to have the Passover meal as well.
Right, have eaten it and everything. Yeah.
Everything. Yeah. So that wouldn't have just worked if somebody just used some blood and it would have been good to go. I mean, it was a cute story.
Right.
But as far as what I'm understanding you saying is that no, that wouldn't have flown.
It did get at this element though of that it not being ethnically based. So that's a good thing that it kind of got at that it was about the ritual and not about, but yeah, it's about the full. Yeah. Also, Yul Brynner was Orthodox.
Yes. Yes. I mean,
and Charles Bronson.
Right. I don't think it's written anywhere, but I do believe that God has a sense of humor. I believe. I don't.
Oh no. If you read the Bible in the original languages, God has a sense of humor.
Okay, good. I didn't catch that one. Good.
Yes. Christ was even sarcastic sometimes.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Demetrios.
Hi. What's the best way to kind of? I know I listen to you a lot, and on the other podcast, you get on a lot about demythologizing, the fact that the Bible's demythologized and it gets rid of a lot of these proper names. And even here, I'm seeing instances where understanding the proper names would have been helpful. Where's the best way to get that, like for us just doing this, studying at home?
Yeah. I recommend to a lot of people getting, if you don't already have one, the NET, the New English Translation Bible. But be sure and get the one that says Full Notes Edition. Because the translation is not that good, but the notes, if you get the full notes, the notes are incredible. Right? So if you get a Full Notes Edition, the page, like the top of the page will have like 3 verses. And then down both sides and like surrounding it, there are all these notes. And the notes are about the original languages, explaining what's going on in the original languages in English, right? So, and it goes through like all the languages. So like if you're going through Genesis, it'll have here's the Hebrew, here's the Greek, here's Aramaic, here's Syriac, here's all the different ancient versions, comparing them, right? Like here's all the information. And you can get the NET Full Notes edition relatively cheaply in print format, because the folks who translated it in the Society for Biblical Literature willingly gave up the copyright. So anyone who wants to print one can print one. So you could get a pretty nice hardcover copy for like 20-25 bucks of the whole Bible with all those notes. That's and there are other people who print fancier ones with leather covers or whatever, but literally anybody who wants to print one can print one. So that makes it pretty affordable. But that's what I recommend if you're primarily reading in English, but you want to get back at a lot of the original language kind of stuff and see some of that stuff.
Thank you. Christos Anesti.
Alithos Anesti.
Father, this is Eric. I had a quick question.
Yes.
It is not, at least I don't think it is, relative to this actual study, but there was but I thought about you and wanting to ask you this question as it appeared a couple of times in the services toward the end of last week. And every time it came up, I said, I've got to ask Father Stevens. And it was a referral to Amalek in the past. And I've been flipping through my service book and I can't find it. And I was wondering if you might explain if you know what I'm referring to and what that means.
Yeah. So Amalek shows up a few places. The most common place he shows up in our liturgics is in the first ode of the canon, verses of the first ode of the canon. Mm-hmm. In particular, the first ode of the canon of the cross, because Israel was fighting the Amalekites at Mount Sinai when that scene where Moses had to keep his arms stretched out, and whenever he had his arms up stretched out, they were winning, and if he started to let them down, they started to lose. And so Joshua and had to come and Aaron had to come and hold his arms up, right? So they'd win. Mm-hmm. So they tend to use, he's holding his arms out, stretching out his arms, connect that to the cross as a sign of victory, right? And the importance of it being a victory over Amalek is that Amalek is sort of exhibit A, and we'll be getting to him not long after the Exodus here. Amalek and the Amalekites are the exhibit A prime example of a giant clan. Amalek himself was, if I'm remembering right, a grandson. It might be great-grandson, but I think grandson of Esau.
Right. Okay.
But it says that
I found it.
Okay.
It says the children of those who were saved hid underground the God who made the persecuting giant of old to disappear in the waves of the sea. As for us, however, let us praise the Lord, as did the youths, for in glory hath he been glorified.
Right. Yeah, that is Pharaoh is actually the persecuting giant.
Okay, that was my question. I don't know where I somehow connected that with Amalek. Okay. So that is Pharaoh.
Yeah. In the genealogy of Esau, it says that Amalek's mother was the sister of Lotan. Lotan being the old Canaanite form of the name Leviathan.
Right.
So being a sister of Leviathan, that's bad, right?
By the way, isn't this Lord of Spirits night, by the way?
Yeah. No. Technically last Thursday was, but we did it a week early.
Oh. Okay.
Because the second Thursday fell in Holy Week. So we weren't doing one, obviously, Thursday night of Holy Week. So we did it a week early.
Okay.
So there's going to be one next week.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you, Father.
Well, we're actually right at time. So I don't know if there's any last question Otherwise, we could probably bring this to a close here.
Be on the lookout for there are already pages up at various places on the internet. That's how soon it's coming. A new book from me.
You know, I've been looking on the interwebs for this new book. I have not seen it yet.
Well, the Goodreads page is up, for example.
Oh, okay.
It might even have a date on there when it's coming out.
Excellent.
Which
well, that's the perfect
confirm nor deny.
That's the perfect teaser. We will all be on the lookout like hawks for that next book. So. And please keep writing them, Father. You're giving us great fodder for our book studies.
Yeah. Well, the next one, I'm working on finishing up the manuscript for the one after that. So,
of course you are.
There's a pipeline.
While somehow staying up to date with Star Trek Picard and making references to Breaking Bad on Lord of Spirits, I'm blown away every time you know all these references.
Well, I just before in the last week of Lent, I rewatched the last season of Better Call Saul with my mom, who hadn't seen it. So.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, before we give away too many more family secrets, we should probably bring this to a close. But that's awesome, by the way. Thank you for sharing that, Father. Thank you all for being on this evening, and especially Father Stephen for another very enlightening Bible study this bright Thursday. Thank you for making time for us here the week following Pascha, when I'm sure you're exhausted from all the liturgics that you've been in the middle of. But it's always a joy to be with you, and we sure appreciate your time, Father.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Father.
All of you.
All right, you all have a great evening. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Truly
risen indeed.